أحب الصالحين ولست منهم لعلي أن أنال بهم شفاعة وأكره من تجارتهم معاصي وإن كنا سويا في البضاعة.
Deadlock. That is how the period in between Imam al-Ash'ari and Ibn Taymiyyah was described. A period wherein the state-sponsored Ash'ari school was an absolute monolith that could not be questioned, even as they unwittingly caused the decline of the Islamic world. Muslim merchants conducted business in markets in Europe, India, and China, and became patrons of the arts and sciences. Scholars from all walks of life pursued the sciences and the arts, wrote poetry and prose, and studied the Quran and Sunnah for its own sake. But as the state drew more upon the wealth of the people to fund their armies in the face of invasion and crises one after the other, markets and revenues declined. And with declining revenues, scholarship declined. Whatever scholars remained had to rely solely upon the state, and the state cared less for the study of what was right and more for their right to rule. It would be the Ash'ari school of theology and the Sufi mystics who would come to uphold the state's right to rule in their sermons and their study circles. And in exchange, the state granted them a near monopoly on all religious institutions. The Islamic Golden Age was already in decline, but nobody wanted to admit it. And so, nobody could address it until it was too late. O people, know that you have committed great sins, and that the great ones among you have committed these sins. If you ask me what proof I have for these words, I say it is because I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would have not sent a punishment like me upon you. The rivers ran red with blood and black with ink. The smell of ash and burnt flesh tainted the air. Pillars of smoke in the hundreds of thousands rose up to clouds above from the city below. Pyramids of bones, the screams of women and children echoed through once vibrant streets. Grand pillars and arches that once held up great domes, libraries, mosques, and palaces crumbled to dust in little over a week. Baghdad had fallen. Once it was the seat of the mighty Abbasid Caliphate, patrons of science and religion, rulers of the greatest civilization the world had seen at the time, and heirs to the legacy of the Prophet ﷺ and his house. It was here that the Islamic Golden Age began and flourished, and it was here that it died. Once the city of peace, the center of scholarship across the known world, where science, mathematics, linguistics, historiography, and theology echoed throughout its halls. It was now but rubble and ash in the middle of a barren, forsaken desert. It was the Mongols who razed Baghdad and brought the Islamic world to its knees. These uncivilized barbarians from far to the east worshipped the sky and reigned as cruel, ruthless tyrants over the many lands they conquered. But how? How could these disbelieving barbarians, who knew nothing of Allah or His Prophet ﷺ, have been allowed to rain down such destruction upon the believers? How could they have ended centuries of Islamic dominance in so short a time? How could the Muslims have lost the favor of Allah in this dire moment? This was a question which threatened to unravel the fabrics of Islamic civilization and society, and it was a question that would be answered by a boy from Haran, driven from his home by these very invasions. And often I thought that the emergence of such as these deviants in great part caused the emergence of the Mongols and the decline of Islamic law, and that these people directly precede the Antichrist who will claim to be God. This boy would become Ibn Taymiyyah. He would become known not only as Sheikh al-Islam Taqiyuddin, but also as the destroyer of Deadlock. At the young age of 7, he was forced to flee Haran with his family from the Mongol invasions, and eventually found himself in Damascus, where his genius would be nurtured. At a young age, he had already memorized the Quran and many hadith collections by heart, and had mastered a great many sciences. He was known for his photographic memory and fearlessness in confronting what he deemed as falsehood. Barely out of his late teens, he had already acquired the qualifications to teach Islamic sciences at the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and later on, he would take part in fighting against the Crusaders and the Mongols on different occasions. As the Islamic world struggled with the question of why Allah has punished them so, Ibn Taymiyyah pointed to the philosophers, the mystics, and the grave worshippers. His diagnosis was that they had corrupted contemporary Islamic beliefs and practices, and so Allah has punished them so for straying from the religion. And so he called for a return to pure monotheism by abandoning their blind adherence to corrupted traditions and emulating the righteous Salaf in their beliefs and practices. As thousands flocked to the firebrand scholar, the contemporary religious establishment, who feared for their power and influence, turned to the authorities and had him arrested and tried for treason and heresy. His books and his pen were confiscated, his ideas suppressed, and his followers persecuted. He died in prison. The very state that had persecuted him would fall to the Ottomans almost 2 centuries later. Then the Ottomans themselves faced corruption and decline, as the Sufi mystics cemented their power and influence through the Janissary Corps, which crushed any and all attempts at administrative and military reform. For a time, Kadizadeli preachers sought to revive the call for reform, gaining the ear of sultans and grand viziers, before being driven out by state intrigue and interests of the religious establishment. As rot plagued the empire from within, as Christian empires encroached upon their borders, and as industry advanced beyond rivalry in the West, Ibn Taymiyyah's accusation of religious corruption and call for reform echoed throughout the empire's dying carcass. From the unconquered, forgotten deserts of Najd, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud al-Mukrin formed a pact to renew Ibn Taymiyyah's call for reform. The Dajsti Da'wah movement, through the first Saudi state, shook the Ottoman Middle East and spread across the Arabian Peninsula, threatening the balance of power. And it took the combined forces of Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, with some later British support, to take it down and attempt to extinguish its remaining influence, but not for long. Decades later, and centuries after Ibn Taymiyyah, as the Ottoman Empire continued to rot and decay from within and without, Muhammad Abduh would independently come up with a similar diagnosis to the decline of Islamic civilization. As the West advanced far beyond the Islamic world and began to increasingly encroach upon its borders, Abduh blamed the blind adherence to the corrupted traditions of the Ash'ari and Sufi institutions and called for reform and the return to Islam as it was practiced by the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age. He looked to the West and saw that they were more like the scholars of old than the scholars of today, and called for a reopening of the gates of ijtihad and modernization in emulation of the West. One of Abduh's most prominent students would be Rashid Rida. Like his teacher before him, he called for a rejection of blind adherence to corrupted traditions and advocated a reopening of the gates of ijtihad. However, he feared the direction that some of his fellow reformists were taking the movement in, and he used his influence to pivot it away from Western-style modernization and toward Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's Dajti Da'wah movement. The Salafi movement, as we know it today, was born. Not all of Abdu's students followed the path of Rida. Some turned to the West, as Abduh did. Others took up arms and called for revolution. But it was nevertheless the Salafi movement that would come to lead the charge. inheriting its methodology from Ibn Taymiyyah, and calls for the reopening of the gates of ijtihad from Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Rida. The Salafi movement would once again call out the Ash'ari and Sufi institutions for corrupting the religion of Islam and call for the reform and renewal of Islam as it was practiced by the Righteous Salaf. This time, however, there would be no one to stop them. On October 29, 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War. And on November 1st, 1922, the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. When Ibn Taymiyyah first called for reform, the religious establishment used their influence to have the state imprison the upstart scholar, persecute his followers, and suppress his ideas. Now, there was no such state to keep them in check. The deadlock was finally destroyed. Islamic Reformation had begun.
تحب الصالحين وأنت منهم ومنكم سوف يلقون الشفاعة وتكره من تجارتهم معاصي وقاك الله من شر البضاعة